Right, well, welcome everyone. We're going to give people another minute or two to join, and then we'll get started. Grab a coffee, get comfortable. And while we wait to get started, if you're able, you could take a moment to drop in the chat one word that describes how your school currently feels about AI. All right, I see a few more joining in. We'll get going in just a moment. All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome to Rethinking Learning in the Age of AI, Tools, Not Shortcuts. I'm Odette Falone, Director of Instructional Strategy and Delivery here at Inspired Instruction. And over the last several years, I've worked alongside schools and educators navigating instructional shifts around technology, student engagement, academic integrity. And right now, one of the biggest tensions that we are seeing in schools and that schools are facing is around how to respond to AI thoughtfully, not necessarily reactively, but actually strategically. That's going to be a big focus of what we talk about today. And this conversation really matters because schools are trying to balance two really real concerns right now, protecting authentic learning while also preparing students for a future where AI will absolutely be a part of their world. So again, we're going to be digging into a lot of that today. Joining me today for our session is my colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Ziano. She will be helping to monitor the Q&A space and to respond to questions. So please feel free to add any thoughts or questions in that space as we go. And we'll also be taking time at the end of today's session to ask and answer questions as a whole group. All right. So let's begin to dig in. And before we really do so, just to share a little bit about our organization and who we are here at Inspired Instruction. As I mentioned earlier, we work alongside educators to turn new learning into something that actually works in classrooms and makes a difference for students. So everything that we're sharing here today comes from our experience partnering with schools and seeing what truly sticks in practice. The goal for today is to make sure that you walk away with something practical, tangible, and immediately applicable to use in your classrooms and your school buildings. So let's get started. So, thinking to start our webinar today about the challenges that schools are facing regarding this topic. What we're seeing in schools, right now is, as I mentioned before, just that growing tension between protecting student thinking and preparing students for a world where AI is affecting, how people work, how they communicate, how they solve problems. The reality is students are using AI already, right? And the question that we're going to be focusing on a lot today is not whether they should use it, but instead how we are teaching them to use it thoughtfully, ethically, and critically. So at this time, let's take a quick moment to think about one way you see AI being misused in your school or in your classrooms that you're working with. Take a moment to think about that. Drop your response in the chat if you have something in mind. And this will likely lead a lot of our conversations throughout today's webinar. So I'll let you take a moment to pop an answer in the chat if you have one. Okay. So one thing that we hear frequently is students are using AI as a shortcut, right? That's a challenge that we're facing. Also, just teachers feeling like AI is changing so rapidly and that It's hard to keep up with how to navigate technology and how to utilize it, right? But in fact, a lot of these challenges are leading us to recognize that AI is actually kind of exposing where there may already be some shallow learning taking place. Because if the goal for a student is really just to produce an answer, let's say, students are always going to look for the easiest and fastest way to be able to do that, right? But if the goal is to explain their thinking or analyze evidence or defend a conclusion, shortcuts stop really being enough for that. So we really have to shift in education and focus on the reasoning and the judgment that we are asking of students to be able to, successfully work and teach and learn with AI alongside us. So, what will you leave with today? By the end of our time together today, my hope is that you'll leave with both a mindset shift and some immediately usable strategies, right? So, that's where we'll be leading. So, a shift in thinking about how AI can support deeper learning rather than replace thinking. That's a central focus that we'll be working with today. We'll also be leaving with practical strategies, things that you can implement into your classroom tomorrow, question prompts, templates, reflection tools, frameworks that can preserve productive struggle, and some leadership actions that you can try. Next steps that can start to, you know, spark the conversation into how AI is going to be thoughtfully integrated into your classrooms. Big ideas that we're going to explore. So, just to reiterate, right? Why productive struggle matters in the age of AI. The difference between AI replacing thinking and extending thinking. How to redesign learning tasks so thinking stays visible. This is a big focus of what we're going to be talking through today. How we can take tasks that we've been assigning students year after year and rethink the way that we're assigning them so that we can see student thinking taking place. And then again, some small instructional shifts that schools can implement immediately. Small shifts that can lead to some big change, right? So we're going to spend our time focused on that central idea, as I mentioned, of AI not replacing productive struggle, but instead deepening thinking. And we'll pause a few times throughout the session today to answer some reflection questions, have some chat participation. So please feel free to share your thinking as we go. And before we can really decide, how students use AI, we first need to understand what actually drives learning. So that's what we're going to dig into next. Why productive struggle matters. So take a quick look at this infographic here, right? Struggle leading to support. As I just said, before we can even think about how we ask students to use AI, we need to take a step back and think about a more important question, right? What actually causes learning? And that is going to be the underlying piece of what we're thinking of. A big misconception that we see in education is that completing work or completing a task automatically means that learning happened. But decades of learning science really show that deep learning happens when there's cognitive effort, right? So students are building understanding when they're working through the components that you see on the screen here, right? Wrestling with ideas, retrieving information, revising their thinking, when they're making mistakes, when they're working through something that has some uncertainty in it. The productive struggle is not actually a problem. It's part of the learning process. And the challenge with AI is that sometimes it's removed from, the thinking process is almost removed, so the learning doesn't stick, right? Another way to think about it is like, how many times have you had a conversation with friends or family members thinking of trying to think about something, even like a trivia idea, what year, let's say, did the t movie Titanic come out? And everyone's trying to guess or remember or whatnot. But every time you see these conversations happening, what happens? Somebody pulls their phone out, looks it up. Oh, 1997. Oh, yeah, great. And then they move on. If you asked anyone in that group what year the Titanic came out the next day, the same situation would probably occur, right? You'd have people not really sure again. Oh, I forget. What was it? Because the process of getting to that answer was just looking it up and retrieving it, and then it just did not stick. But instead, if those members of that group having that conversation about the movie started thinking through it differently and said, oh, yeah, what song was playing when that movie came out or on the radio? Or what was that before or after middle school that came out? You start to dig into those things and determine what year it was on your own. You're likely to remember that now for a longer amount of time, right? So, kind of a silly analogy to think about it, but really just kind of helps to visualize the idea of the difference between the ways that things stick as we are learners and how important meaningful thinking is in that process. So another way to look at it, you can see here, cognitive effort, how that leads to durable learning. One of the shifts that schools need to distinguish between is students finishing work and students engaging in thinking, right? It's not necessarily the same thing. We know AI can increase efficiency, but efficiency and learning are not always the same thing, right? So in some cases, that slower, more challenging, messier kind of moment is where the deep learning takes place and deep learning happens. And that aligns with decades of research around productive struggle and, cognitive load and just the idea that effortful learning often will create stronger, long-term understanding. So take a look at the chart here to kind of see that side by side. On the left, you see learning that lasts, right? Retrieval and recall, productive struggle, as we've been saying, revision and reflection, that cognitive effort and sense making. On the right, we see learning that fades quickly, copying, answer getting, minimal thinking, all of those things. Again, I'll reiterate this a few times today, but the goal is not to eliminate AI from learning, but instead to preserve the thinking that goes on in the classroom, preserve the thinking that takes place in order to produce, assignments or tasks or outcomes. One last quick analogy that I always think really makes a lot of sense. If I use a GPS every single time that I'm driving somewhere, am I going to get to where I need to go correctly? Yes. Am I going to have a mental map of how I got there? Probably not. Am I going to be able to do it tomorrow without a GPS? Probably not. Right? Think about those kinds of things really do put into perspective a lot of these kinds of things happening with AI and the instant response and the dependency that students have on it and even adults have on it, and the learning that or the deep thinking that is no longer happening. Okay, so all that, sharing of research to kind of move into that mindset shift that we talked about a little bit earlier. And this here, restriction to design, is the central idea of our webinar today. It is the main focus that we're going to be putting forward for our next few slides and into the practical strategies that I'm going to be sharing momentarily. But when it comes to AI, schools often kind of think about two extremes, right? Unrestricted use, there may be in some cases, of AI, and then on the other hand, complete restriction, right? So both or neither one really actually teaches students how to think responsibly about how AI is used. The real important work here is the instructional design. So we want to think that the question is no longer how do we stop students from using AI? That's not where we want to be headed at this point. Again, it's part of our lives now. It will be part of our students' futures. So instead, we want to ask, how do we design learning experiences where thinking still matters? Let that sink in a minute. Because again, that focus question, designing learning experiences where thinking still matters, it may have at some point or another gotten away. Because, like I said earlier, sometimes those assignments that we've been using year after year, the expectation is that in being able to produce, an essay or a research project, there needs to be thinking taking place because before these tools did not exist and that was happening. But now we need to really think about how we can redesign these learning experiences so the learning can still happen, right? The cognition can still happen. So let's take a quick look at this AI use continuum, right? Just again, to drive this home a little further. On the left, where it says AI replaces thinking. These are some typical assignments that, many of us see on a day-to-day basis, writing essays, solving math problems, generating answers, or completing tasks. In those cases, we now can replace the thinking with AI. However, if you flip that script a little bit to the column on the right and think about using AI to support thinking, you can use it as a tool to support deeper learning, to support higher level learning, right? Where you have AI instead brainstorm counter arguments and discuss those, or explain misconceptions, or help students revise their reasoning or extend their inquiry. The distinction here is really whether AI is replacing the cognition or supporting the cognition. So that's what you see left or right on this column. And this becomes just incredibly powerful for teachers and administrators to think about because it moves the conversation away from policing AI and towards just the instructional practice, good instructional practice and good instructional purpose. Okay. So what does this look like in classrooms? Let's take a look now into some ways that you might be able to identify or visualize what a before and after could look like in a classroom of two different assignments. So what you see on my screen here are three different assignments, three different tasks in writing, reading, and science before AI task design, right? So we have a 5-paragraph essay about climate change. Think about how we can take that assignment where students might be able to dump that right into AI and or ChatGPT or what have you and ask it to write a 5-paragraph essay about climate change. And then now you're stuck in a position where you're trying to determine if there was any thinking happening at all on the student side. But instead, if again we redesign that and think about how we can incorporate AI to deepen the learning, you can ask AI to generate 3 competing claims about climate change or climate policy. And then, as a group, as a class, as an individual, you evaluate which claim is strongest and then use the evidence from your research. So, again, pulling out different components and then having students justify, evaluate, analyze what what the AI output is. In the reading example of just summarizing the text, okay, sure. Have AI summarize the text. And now the assignment is to critique the AI accuracy, the summary of the accuracy. So if students read the text, if you read as a whole group, if you discuss it together, now you're going line by line critiquing what AI used and what's missing. Poke holes in it. Think through, what may be accurate, what may not be accurate. And that alone might be a very surprising idea for many students because what they receive as output from many of these AI models, they see as 100% true. So bringing that awareness to the fact that things can be missed or things can be incorrect and AI can make mistakes and having them recognize that they can identify those mistakes can be pretty exciting. The last piece on science there, another before and after, writing an explanation of a lab. Instead, have students identify flaws in maybe the AI generated hypothesis, right? So they're working with some analytical thinking there. Just to kind of to reiterate, the strongest classrooms really are not removing AI entirely. They're redesigning tasks like this. So students must evaluate, critique, justify, revise, compare, defend their thinking, all of that. These are things that our standards are asking us to do, are telling us to incorporate into our classrooms so that students can be prepared for college and career. So we really can use this as a launching point to be able to redesign our tasks and start to engage in some of that deeper thinking. Okay, so some teacher language here that can change the culture of a classroom, right? This will help teachers, including these prompts or questions in their discussions with students, can help teachers, think about AI less like an answer generator and more like a thought partner, right? And they also help to make that metacognition visible for students. So simply injecting some of these prompts, again, whenever possible, asking students to show where thinking happened. If you are using an AI generated piece, asking them, what did they disagree with? What did AI miss? How did your thinking change after you read that? Or, where did you struggle? Bringing in that human element, like I said earlier, and understanding that it's okay to disagree with AI. Students are frequently inclined to just use it because it's very agreeable or affirming in its language responses back to students or users. And it's important to have them recognize you can push back, you can poke holes, you can ask it, you can look into what AI has missed. That is possible. And that is, deeper thinking that leads to deeper learning. So I have a resource that I'll be able to share with you later that will incorporate these prompts and list them out. So these are things that even if you have in post-it notes on your desk, or included intentionally in lesson plans and assignments, they can start to bring out that discussion and thinking that will lead to a culture change in the classroom with regards to this. Okay, so think about a current assignment or a learning task that's already taking place in your school. Okay. We know that research shows that 42% of you're more likely, 42% more likely to remember something that you write down, right? So I'm going to ask that you take a post-it note or an index card in a moment and just jot down your thoughts. But before we get there, thinking about a current assignment or learning task in your school, um, ask yourself these questions and jot down, what adjustment or what change you can make to that assignment that would require students to think more deeply. So thinking about that assignment, take a moment to jot down, where might AI be replacing productive struggle? I'm sure you can think about it in any different content area, in any different subject, right? Grade level, what have you. There are examples of this happening all over the place, whether it be in the classroom itself or in the home, in the household during, independent assignments. Where might AI currently be replacing productive struggle? And once you've identified that, think about what's one adjustment that could require students to think more deeply. So the goal here is not to redesign everything overnight by any means, right? Sometimes one small tweak, one small adjustment like this can shift a task from being a passive completion task to something very meaningful. So I'll give you a moment to think about that, jot it down. And again, remember that statistic, 42% more likely to make it happen if you jot it down, even if it's stuck on a post-it note and, something that you take a look at tomorrow. Okay. So hopefully we have a couple of ideas jotted down. And I'm just going to continue to think about some of those challenges. So this could kind of lend itself really nicely to our next slide. So I know I mentioned earlier some challenges that we're seeing in schools with regards to this topic. As you see on the screen here, these are a lot of things that educators are sharing that they're thinking or feeling about when you bring up the topic of AI, right? Feeling overwhelmed, like no idea where to start. Maybe there's not a clear policy yet in place, and that's okay. Students moving faster than the systems is really a big factor, right? Students are well into a routine or using AI in many cases before it's even being talked about or utilized in the classroom. So there's a habit breaking that's going to need to take place. Of course, the fear of academic dishonesty, but specifically that lack of shared language is something we'll focus on in a moment. Um, AI proofing everything, not possible at this stage. So that's why we're really focusing in on that redesign piece and using it as a tool to support deeper thinking. So I know I said earlier, but really where it gets tricky is trying to think about eliminating AI through restriction or any of those kind of things that really just creates like a fear of the tool, and it does not build capacity in how to use it. So what schools really need in this case are shared expectations, like I said, right? So a lot of these things we're talking through, having these conversations with your staff and students and understanding that we can use AI to our benefit to support learning, to support some of that deeper thinking and cognition. and the clarity behind it. So sharing some of those before and afters, and I'm going to share more of them with you in a moment. Sharing some of those before and afters, what it looks like in the classroom, how to design these activities or tasks to incorporate AI. And we'll talk more about, some of the moves that you can make as an educator, as an administrator, to alleviate some of the challenges that you see here on the screen. Okay, so what can school leaders do right now? So as I mentioned, creating that shared language about productive struggle. Have time, set time to discuss with teachers, right? Define what productive struggle is, describe it, talk about what it looks like, where you've seen it, what kinds of assignments have a deep productive struggle taking place, and share the research about how that leads to, more lasting learning, right? Long lasting learning. And using that information, you can start to redesign a few high leverage tasks. Just a few, maybe one or two, right? To take those high leverage tasks, things that will really make a change, and identify those and start to just work together to redesign them to incorporate some of these strategies that we're sharing. Really normalizing this is important too. So allow teachers to take risks and try things out, play around with some of the different things that they could use to experiment with AI and kind of again experiment with the design of these tasks that they're assigning students. And finally, just focus on thinking evidence, not the final product, right? So it's hard to do that. We've been using final products for so long to really identify and analyze what students have learned. And changing that can feel really uncomfortable. But taking a step back and really focusing on, again, what's the evidence that students were thinking through something? How can you tell? And then really shifting the mindset towards that goal instead can really make a huge difference, right? I think it really makes the task much more manageable when you stop trying to create like perfect policies. Of course, we need policies, but really we're going to be figuring these things out in time. And instead, just really building that shared language around what instructional understanding looks like and how to get there. So I'm going to share a few instructional shifts for real change here, framework and some templates, and some of those before and after pieces that I mentioned with you a moment ago. Everything that I share in this section, resources and frameworks and things, will all be available to you after today's webinar. You'll receive a one-page sheet with links to each of these resources that you can download and use today or tomorrow, as soon as you receive them, whenever you're ready to. So the first is a very simple framework, and I really believe keeping it simple in this particular area is super important. This is called the Pause, Prompt, Prove framework, and it can be used in both a teacher's world when they're designing or redesigning assignments, but also in a student's world when they're completing tasks, right? It helps us start to shift the conversation from "Did you use AI?" to how did you use AI and where is the evidence of your thinking? Always coming back to that, right? So to start, we pause. If I'm a teacher redesigning an assignment, I'm looking at an assignment, what I'm going to be trying to change, and identifying in that task what requires or what thinking is required in order to complete it. What am I looking to get at? What do I want to see that students know or are able to do? And then you may inject AI strategically, right? So in that assignment, or if you're a student, you're injecting it strategically, and we've talked through what that looks like. And then finally proving, right? Demonstrating the reasoning, the evidence, the reflection. So as a teacher, I'm taking a look at how I'm going to ask students to show me their reasoning or their evidence or reflect to tell me how they used AI and why and what they learned from the experience, right? So this very simple framework just kind of gives you three things to think through as a designer of tasks, but also as a student completing work. Thinking about what the task requires, and instead of using AI to replace it, using it to augment, right, their thinking and then prove their reasoning, their revisions, and their evidence. So this framework will, again, I will share this with you, but this framework will also lend itself to some of the additional tools I'm going to share with you next. I know this is a lot of text on the screen, but I just want to share with you this, a couple of examples that you see here. And this resource will be available in that document I mentioned earlier. But this is a great framework to kind of take a look at with before and after tasks that have been redesigned for thinking visibility, right? So if I take a look at that top right-hand corner there, I'm just going to start with our health and SEL, right? We talked a little bit about reading, writing, and science earlier, even math. But if I look at that right-hand column, the before assignment or task is to research stress management strategies. Something we've probably done as a student, something we've probably seen assigned in our classrooms, right? Researching stress management and presenting them to a group. Now, if we take that a step further and use AI to, again, strengthen the assignment, to deepen the thinking, now we're using AI to generate a list of stress management strategies. That's the start. Now, instead, after that point, we are asking students to evaluate which strategies are most realistic and effective for teenagers and explaining their reasoning using personal reflection or evidence or what have you, right? So see how that takes that to the next level, where now instead of typing something in, printing it out, talking about it a little bit, that's learning that's not going to necessarily stick. But if they're evaluating these strategies that AI has generated and thinking about it through their own lens, through their classmates, through things they've heard and seen and evidence that they've read about, they're able to really go on a deeper level with those strategies. They're tapping into creativity, reflection, communication, among other things. So this table here will provide you with a few other examples for different content areas. But really thinking through this type of process and taking this type of process where you may have teachers engaging in the same kind of work, right? Thinking about a task that they use and then coming up with how they can redesign it and being explicit about how that new task makes student thinking visible. That's the goal, right? So a great resource just to use as a model. A couple of other tools that I'm going to share with you here today, and again, will be available to you afterwards, are an AI task redesign checklist for teachers that can be used before assigning something to think through, okay, I have an old assignment I've used for decades. Let me take that assignment and put it through this checklist and see how I can redesign it to make this a stronger learning experience. And then on the right, we have a student template that can be used for students after completing assignments. It's a reflection template. So I'll open these up quickly here just to give you a quick preview of what they look like and how they can be used. So as I mentioned, this is for teachers, an AI task redesign checklist. And they're taking an assignment or a task that they have in the past utilized and putting it through this checklist. So thinking about what was the goal or what's the learning goal of this assignment? What cognitive work matters most in this task and starting there, right? So that's what we want to keep as our central focus as we are thinking about that task. And then using that to help analyze the assignment that currently exists. Could AI complete this task independently? If yes, that's where we want to start thinking, okay, what may need redesign? Maybe because I'm only assessing the final product. That might be something that needs to change. Maybe I'm only asking for surface level responses. That might need to change. And again, I'm sure as we're talking through this, you're thinking this would be a process that could help to audit some of the assignments and tasks that are already taking place, whether we're thinking about AI in the picture or not, to be able to identify places that we can start to inject deeper thinking as it is, right? So step 3 is to redesign it for thinking visibility. So it gives some options for opportunities for students to do different things like defend their decisions or connect ideas or analyze mistakes. And then step 4 is where we start to consider productive AI use. If there's a place that it makes sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that a redesign must include AI, but it can help students do some of these things that you see on the screen, right? Clarify confusion, organize their thinking, but they should still be making decisions or, reflecting on learning and things like that. And then finally, adding thinking prompts, those 5 questions that I mentioned to you earlier in our webinar, or 6 questions, looks like here, that teachers can include when they are speaking with students and injecting them into their lesson plans and activities to deepen thinking is a great factor. Okay, so toggling quickly over to the student template. This again is an after assignment template. So once an assignment has been completed, they can reflect on their use of AI. And this could lead to a really great discussion. Is this something that you want to use for every single task or assignment that you assign students? Absolutely not. But strategically, this can really inform you of where students are using AI, how they're using it, what parts, you see that students are using thinking and where they're not. So it gets them to think about their thinking process, how they used AI, what it helped them to do, what they still had to do themselves as an individual. And then it has them evaluate, what AI came up with, what output, and finally finally reflect about their thinking and provide evidence of their thinking. Okay, so it provides some great sentence stems, some, check boxes for them to kind of think through some options, but it's really, really informative for the educator, for the person who's developing the tasks, to be able to to see some of this coming from a student's reflection. And again, this is not something that you're doing for every assignment, every task by any means, but really injecting it strategically to be able to support growth and development of your students. Okay. So here we're just going to come back to what matters most. Um, as I said many times today, the goal is not to eliminate AI from learning environments. The goal is really to ensure that students are still engaging in thinking, that their learning is leading to growth and transfer and understanding and all of those things. We know AI is not going away, and we know that studies show how important productive struggle is for learning. So the goal, again, is to design learning where thinking remains visible. Um, Before AI became so accessible for students and for adults, we could trust, like I said earlier, we could trust any assignment, assigning an essay or project that would require some kind of thinking in order to create the output that students are submitting, right? But because now with the resources that are available, it's so easily and readily available for students to jump into an AI platform to start to produce some of that work. We really have to make the shift and rethink our tasks, rethink our assignments, and ensure that we're able to see student thinking happening. And some of these strategies can help you get there. Okay, so remember that statistic about writing things down. If you can, I'd like you to just try to take a quick moment to take out a Post-it or a piece of paper that's near you and write down one small step that you'll try to take within the next 48 hours. I know we are at nearing the end of the academic year, and so with that in mind, this is a great low risk time for you to try something new or for teachers to try something new. And these instructional moves will hopefully lead to a stronger, next academic year, 26-27 academic year. So take a moment, I'll let you think, to jot something down that you might try in the next 48 hours. Okay. All right. So some suggestions if you're thinking through that, right? A reflection prompt, adding a reflection prompt to an assignment or asking students to critique what AI has put out, um, redesigning for deeper thinking, specifically one of the assignments we talked about, or maybe even creating a faculty discussion that is centered around AI use, of course, with guidelines, because that can really get very deep conversation going. But anything, hopefully you have something that you're able to take away and jot that down for trying in the next couple of days. Okay, so I'd like to take this time now to thank you so much for joining us. Um, Again, we know that meaningful change in classrooms is not going to come from one session, but that it actually comes from trying something, from reflecting on it, and continuing to refine it over time. So as you leave today, I hope that you walk away with at least one thing or idea that you're ready to try. And if questions come up and you want to think more deeply about what this could look like in your setting, we're always here to chat as a thought partner. So I'll be hanging on here for any additional questions if you have them. We also have a feedback form that is in the chat. You can also scan the QR code if that's more accessible for you. Scan that on your phone to fill it out. We'd love to hear how you felt about the webinar and what you'd like to see in terms of future webinars coming up. So appreciate your time today, everyone. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. All right, everyone. If there are no questions at this time, that's quite all right. Again, you're welcome to send us an email if something comes up that you're thinking of in the near future, but appreciate your attendance. Again, thank you so much and hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.